Slow stitching is a process of sewing fabric pieces together in a way that is creative and soothing. The finished piece isn't traditional, like something a quilter or a seamstress would make, because the goal isn't a specific result, but instead, the process of creating is the main focus. Slow stitching pieces all begin with fabric collage, but unlike paper collage, we don't use glue to attach the pieces together. Instead, we sew them with deliberate stitches. And these stitches can be exact or precise, or whimsical and unexpected, or even completely made up. These fabric collages are slow stitched together, not following a set pattern. Instead, entire pieces follow prompts or themes, sometimes from other textile artists, or they can be created without any direction. The beauty of slow stitching is that if you have an interest in creating a fabric piece, anyone can. In today's video, I'll show the absolute basics for starting a fabric collage with a simple prompt. Use 3 pieces of scraps. We start our piece with our base fabric. This can be any fabric you have, cut to 3 by 4 inches in size. You want the piece to have some body, so you can use a piece of quilt, or you can layer a piece of batting underneath your fabric to make it thicker, or you can use just 2 layers of fabric, either commercial fabric, something from a charm square, or even repurposed clothing. I'm going to start with a piece of quilted fabric. From here, I find bits and pieces of fabric scraps. I personally prefer sewing with cotton fabrics, but feel free to try sewing with other materials, even paper or leather. The prompt is to choose 3 scraps of fabric, so I want to select ones that look good together. And I cut them to size that I like. Sometimes I fray the edges for added texture and interest. These scraps can be all different sizes, and that's up to you. I design where I want them to go on the collage. When I'm happy with the layout, I pin them in place on my quilted fabric. Now to stitch them together, I'll show you a basic stitch, the stab stitch. Start by threading your needle. You can use cotton thread, quilting thread, or embroidery floss. Each thread has its own thickness and color, so the selection is up to you. Just make sure the thread will fit inside the eye of the needle. Now, needles come in many sizes, but a package of quilting or embroidery needles will serve most of your needs very well. I choose my thread and I cut it to a piece no longer than 20 inches. I thread the needle and make a double or triple knot at the end of the tail of the thread, and sometimes this takes me a couple of tries. Then I make a simple stab stitch where you poke the fabric with your needle from underneath the piece and gently pull your thread through, holding onto the needle. Then go back to the fabric a small distance away from where your needle came out originally and stab back into the fabric and pull your thread through to the back. This is a stitch, and stitches can be made with any length distance from the first stab to the next one. In slow stitching, you choose if you want to make small stitches, large stitches, or if you want to vary them. It's up to you. I like to sew around the perimeter of each scrap piece in the collage, so I make stitches all the way around each shape. This is where the process of slow stitching begins. There is no wrong way to stitch. There is no rule about how many stitches you have to make. You'll develop your own style. You don't have to sew around the piece like I do. You can sew over them and connect them, or do a little bit of both. It's completely up to you. Just enjoy the process. Enjoy creating something new from fabric scraps. I continue sewing all the way around my scraps, stitching up and down, and when I complete the shape, I'll stab the fabric again so my needle comes out the back of the piece. From here, I'll make a knot in my work. Now to do this, I find the nearest stitch to where my needle is, and I bring my needle underneath it, drawing my thread through it. It winds up creating a loop, and again, I draw my needle through that loop, and I pull it tight. This anchors the thread so the stitches don't come out. Sometimes I'll make 2 knots here. And then I clip the thread about 1/4 of an inch or so from that knot. For my next scrap piece, I'm going to use green embroidery floss to match my fabric scrap. I thread the needle again and make a double knot in the end. And then I start sewing stab stitches all the way around the perimeter of the piece. When I finish one side, I pull my thread across the back of the piece to reach the other side of that scrap. So now I can continue stitching around the perimeter, and you can see how this looks on the back of my fabric. I finish stitching the green fabric, knot it and clip it, and then select another thread for my final scrap that I want to stitch down. For my last piece of fabric, I'm using the same thread that I used for the first scrap. I thread my needle, knot my thread, and begin stitching. And just as before, I use stab stitches. I continue around the piece with my stitches, knot it off, and clip the thread. And then finally, I take a look at my piece. Now you can stop there, and you have a finished fabric collage. Or you can continue working on this piece. You can add more stitches, or some embellishments like beads or buttons, or additional fabric. I didn't want to stop there. I pulled out some embellishments and played with the design to see if any of these embellishments would work in my piece, adding more interest. I played with some beads. Now to add beads, you have to make sure the bead will fit through the eye of the needle, and these tiny beads did not. So I had to try a larger bead. And I didn't really like the color of this larger bead, so I set the beads aside. I tried out this fabric butterfly and was happy with that, so I threaded my needle and then set the butterfly where I wanted him to go. I made a few tiny stab stitches to hold him in place, and then I knotted them off and clipped the thread. Here is my finished fabric collage. It was a fun little sewing project that allowed me the chance to slow stitch and be creative with some textiles. If you'd like to see more of my slow stitching pieces, check out my Instagram at Daniela Mellen Artist. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.